So hello everyone, thank you for joining us. Welcome to our Retrofit Webinar Series, where today we will be looking at the minimum energy efficiency standards for domestic landlords. A couple of housekeeping points just before we kind of get underway. We're going to ask that we sort of all stay muted with our cameras off whilst we're sharing the presentations. And we've got the opportunity to kind of switch those on when we move through to our Q&A session in a little while. But we will be recording the session today so that we can signpost this as a resource in the future, which I think is going to be a really important tool for us to continue engaging landlords. As well, if anyone has any questions, please do feel free to pop these in the chat box whilst we're working our way through the presentations today. But we can always unmute as well when we get to that a little bit later on. So hello from me. My name's Abby. I'm a Sustainability Officer at Camden. And just to sort of turn our attentions to the agenda for today, I'm going to briefly set out the context for our discussions and talk a little bit about the domestic emission scene in Camden. I'm then going to hand over to my colleague Michaela, who will set out MEES in a bit more detail, and then it will be back to me just to sort of run through some of the grants that we are able to offer landlords at Camden. I'm also really pleased to say that we're joined by our guest speaker, Dave Prinsep, today. Dave has been involved in energy efficiency and sustainability for a number of years. He is chair of the London Landlord Accredited Scheme and the Private Rented Sector Working Group on Energy Efficiency, and chaired the government's working party advising on the new private rented sector regulations. So yeah, really looking forward to hearing from Dave today. He's going to be talking to us a little bit about those proposed changes that are likely to be coming into force by 2025. We'll then move into our question and answer session, and then we'll sort of finish with some closing remarks and finish for the day. So just a little bit about our webinar series and sort of why we're here. The aim of these sessions is to engage as many people as possible in Camden with the Retrofit Challenge. And we're doing this through various different webinars, looking at different topics, really to kind of engage everyone with the Retrofit Challenge and sort of aim for this zero carbon target in Camden by 2030. So we do have a webpage where all of our previous webinars are sort of listed and recorded, and you'll be able to access those a little bit later on through links included in the presentation. So a little bit about domestic emissions in Camden. So kind of looking at a borough-wide scale, decarbonisation of the electricity grid over the last 10 years or so has significantly contributed to carbon dioxide emissions reduction in Camden. And this has also been seen sort of across other parts of the UK, but it has been one of the main factors to our emissions reduction within the borough. And when we talk about decarbonisation, it really means the removal of carbon dioxide from our energy sources. So the replacement of coal-powered generation to sort of renewable or low carbon technologies such as wind and solar. So with that in mind, emissions in Camden are now 37% below 2010 levels, which is great progress, and this has sort of kind of been straddled by various council strategies as well to bring it to that level. But we still have a long way to go if we want to kind of strive to be a net zero borough by 2030. But I'll come onto that in a little bit more detail shortly. So in Camden, 87% of our carbon dioxide emissions arise from energy usage in buildings. And if we just look at the pie chart, 61% comes from industrial and commercial buildings, with a further 26% coming from our households. So it's the domestic emissions that we're particularly interested in, and it's an area that represents sort of significant carbon savings, especially where kind of decarbonising comes in and kind of looking at where heat in our homes comes from. So just to unpick that sort of 26% figure a little bit more, we have approximately 100,000 homes in Camden, 3/4 of which are flats. And we roughly have an equal proportion of Camden-owned homes to privately owned and those that are privately rented. So that's just kind of equates to about 32,000 homes that are privately rented in Camden. So that really makes it an important target audience to engage with carbon reduction discussions. It's projected sort of by around 2030 that around 85% of a household's emissions will be associated with heating and hot water from gas boilers. So kind of just linking back to that point around decarbonising heat in our homes, it's going to be sort of a really hot topic, pardon the pun. One of the problems that we do have is that because around sort of 3/4 of our homes were built before the introduction of standards for insulation and energy performance, it means that we've got quite a largely inefficient housing stock. And that's sort of a real issue when we think about rectifying that through retrofitting. Because that in itself has its own challenges owing to an ageing housing stock and also the high proportion of flats. And note that we do have a high proportion of flats in Camden, which is kind of coming out at around 75%. So moving on to decarbonising heat in our buildings. So the pie chart on the left, that breaks down the carbon dioxide emissions associated with fuel use from 2005. And if we compare this with the pie chart on the right, which is projected emissions for fuel use by 2030, we can see that that segment attributed to electricity has considerably decreased. And that is owing to considerable decarbonisation that has already happened with the electricity grid. And also further plans for that to happen. But you can see that gas kind of really is that sort of problematic area and is one of the areas that we as a council are definitely kind of looking at ways to reduce through our buildings. You can see that the graph in the middle, that shows the trajectory for grid decarbonisation. And if we look at far left, the 2008 bar, you can see that renewables represents a really, really small kind of green bar. And as we move through the years towards 2030, we can see that green bar relating to renewables kind of grows significantly in size. So that just really demonstrates sort of the way that we're moving with things. There are a number of routes that can be taken to decarbonise homes. I've highlighted the bottom three, just kind of bolded those, because these really are sort of where landlords can have the most impact. The first being the replacement of gas boilers to low carbon technology such as heat pumps, which is powered by electricity. The second, which is increasing production from renewables. Again, this can be done via heat pumps, the installation of solar panels. The third that I kind of want to pull out is sort of improving the overall energy efficiency of the dwelling. By nature, this would happen if you're following points 1 and 2, but as well, you can improve energy efficiency by the installation of insulation, solar thermal, and a number of other measures. The last point around reducing heat demand, that's really where tenants come in, and that is really kind of owing to behavioural changes and lifestyle. So yeah, it's kind of a multifaceted issue, and everyone's sort of got their role to play in it. So moving on a bit, I'm kind of conscious that sort of I've talked about the scale of the issue and perhaps highlighted where landlords are coming in, but this is really to sort of set out the steps that the council are taking to help tackle the issue and support landlords. So the Climate Action Plan was launched in July of last year, and that provides a framework for climate action at a borough-wide scale. The council developed the plan with the community as a direct result of the Citizen Assembly, which was held the summer before that in 2019. And within this plan are 4 areas that are acknowledged, and buildings is one of these. And as part of that, we have committed to making Camden's buildings energy efficient, comfortable and fit for purpose for a zero carbon future. So our climate work is framed within our wider ambition to do all that we can by 2030 to reach net zero. And when talking about that, what we're talking about is reducing emissions associated with fuel consumption within the boundary of Camden. So that directly relates to electricity, gas and transport fuels. So I've just also pulled out a couple of the actions here that we can see on the screen, and sort of these are the ones that are probably most relevant to our session and also sort of our landlord audience. A number of these to sort of help support our kind of ambitions for reaching net zero, but also to support landlords. So part of this, one of them was to deliver a retrofit summit, and that was to engage people with the scale of the retrofit challenge. We kind of had to get a little bit more creative with that owing to the pandemic. We really kind of didn't want to see that go to waste, which is really where our webinar series came from and is sort of you know, where we are today, sort of delivering this and engaging various different audiences. So our climate work continues despite the pandemic and not being able to hold face-to-face sessions. Another one of those is to kind of ensure that all rented homes in the borough sort of go above and beyond the minimum energy efficiency standards, and that involves working closely with landlords, housing associations and so on. Again, another really kind of important one, our Camden Climate Fund, which I will talk about a little bit more in detail, is really kind of providing funding for homeowners, landlords to assist with those energy efficiency improvements. So they're just some of the points that we're kind of the actions that we're kind of delivering or working to deliver as part of our climate action plan and to sort of tackle emissions as a whole. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Michaela, and Michaela's going to talk a little bit to us about MEES. Over to you, Michaela.
Thanks for that, Abby. So firstly, in understanding MEES, we first need to start with the EPC, which is the Energy Performance Certificate. Thanks for that, the slide. So an EPC is an indication of the energy efficiency performance of a given property, which is on an A to G scale. Every property that is put up for rent or to be sold requires an EPC. A being the highest, which would mean the property is relatively cheap to run, and G would be the lowest, meaning it is relatively expensive to run in terms of energy and fuel use. You can see here that in the UK, the average rating is D, which is associated with around 60 points. So how is the certificate issued? A loaded qualified surveyor will assess the energy efficiency of a property and determine how efficient it is. They'll look at things like how efficient the boiler is, whether there are thermostats on the radiators, window glazing, wall cavity insulation, as well as a whole host of other things. The EPC is then issued by the surveyor, and it will also provide recommendations on how to improve that property's rating. The EPC itself lasts for 10 years, and the landlord may seek to change it if they make energy efficiency improvements. The cost of that visit is usually around £60 to £100 and will take about 30 minutes. The data is then put into a national database, which is widely accessible, and anyone here in this call can go out and check on the database to see what their EPC rating is for their property. Next slide, please. So here you can see the EPC composition in Camden. It's worth noting that not all properties require an EPC, so this only represents properties in Camden that had a valid EPC in 2020. In line with the UK average, you can see that for Camden, the average is D, with 37% of properties within this bracket. However, there is quite a large proportion in bracket C as well. At the lower end, you could see the F and G category. There are 3,278 properties, which is about 3.5% of the total housing stock in Camden. However, as Abby said previously, around 32% of these homes would be privately rented. So you could expect just over about 1,000 homes that are privately rented to be in the F or G category. The implications of having an energy efficient home results in higher energy bills for the tenant, but also has a negative environmental impact due to excess fuel use, which is why we're active in trying to change this in Camden. Next slide, please. So what is MEES? We keep talking about this. So MEES is Minimum Energy Efficiency Standards, and it concerns the domestic private rented sector. From the 1st of April 2020, if your property is let on an assured, regulated or domestic agricultural basis and is legally required to have an EPC rating, as it is either put up for rent or sale, it must have an EPC rating of E or above, unless there is a valid exemption in place. So landlords cannot rent a property with an EPC rating of F or G. If a property does have a rating of F and G, and the landlord is planning on letting or selling the property, the landlord must improve the rating to E or above, ideally in line with the recommendations in the EPC report. Landlords should spend up to £3,500, including VAT, on energy efficiency improvements. And this could be a combination of third-party funding, third-party and self-funding, or entirely self-funding. Any improvements, energy efficiency improvements, since October 2017 can be included in this cost cap. If the landlord spends £3,500 on energy efficiency improvements and the rating does not achieve an EPC of E or above, the landlord can register for an exemption. It's called an All Improvements Made exemption. But it is worth noting that if the property is empty and the landlord is not planning on selling or letting the property, no action is required on MEES at all. Next slide, please. So here are some sample recommendations and funding. You can see that in an EPC report, as I've said, you'll get some kind of sample recommendations that is specific to that property. So you'll see the indicative cost, the typical savings per year, and the associated EPC and the EPC points. So you can take a look there. There are also some third-party streams. So, for example, you have the Help to Heat. This is an obligation placed on the largest energy suppliers to support households in installing energy efficiency improvements, and it is means tested. So those in receipt of certain benefits are welcome to apply. You also have the Green Deal, which is a form of loan, which is to be paid back over time. You'll also see more information at the end of our slides with more support. And you also have the Renewable Heat Incentive. This is actually a financial incentive set out by the government, and those who successfully qualify for RHI will receive quarterly payments over 7 years, which is the estimated amount of clean, green or renewable heat that their system produces. The payments are tax-free, and again, you can go and check that out with that link there. Next slide, please. So here we have some exemptions and enforcements. So there are a whole host of exemptions for properties that can't make the E rating, or it's not. There's exemptions to why this cannot be done. So we've already spoken about the first, which is the all relevant improvements, which is if you cannot get to that E rating despite spending the 3,500, which is outlined by the cost cap. There are some other exemptions there, which you're free to go and have a look on the government website, and I would recommend you to do so if this is something you are thinking of. Most of the exemptions do last for 5 years and would need to be renewed. However, the last exemption there, which has recently become a landlord, that lasts for 6 months. and that gives anyone who has recently become a landlord a period of 6 months to make any necessary improvements after that period. If the property has not got an exemption and it is also has not got an E rating, local authorities can go ahead with enforcement proceedings. First, a compliance notice will be served and will be issued for a period of 18 months. In that time, the landlord should go ahead and make any changes that is necessary. If not, there is a financial penalty. And you can see in the table below that they start from 1,000 and go up to 4,000, depending on the reason, which is up to a maximum of £5,000. Next slide, please. So I think here I'll be handing back to my colleague Abby, who will talk more about grants for landlords in Camden.
Great, thank you, Michaela, and thank you for so clearly setting out those requirements under MEES. So now I'm just going to, sort of off the back of some of those funding streams that Michaela highlighted, sort of at a national scale, just going to bring that back down to Camden and talk through some of the grants that are available to support landlords. So the first grant that I kind of want to shed a light on is the Landlord Energy Efficiency and Insulation Grant. And under this, we have varying levels of funding available depending on how many bedrooms within the dwelling that there is. So this is available from £1,500 all the way through to £15,000. However, it should be noted, though, that if you do have multiple dwellings with varying different kind of number of rooms, and that total amount equates to more than the £15,000 per building, you would be capped at £15,000. So something to sort of be mindful of. In terms of eligibility for this grant, so it's only available for properties that are rated D, E or F or only. So these are obviously kind of our most inefficient dwellings, therefore they take priority, and it really is for those properties only. And that's something that's identified prior to the works commencing. In order to kind of proceed with the grant, you also must be a member of the London Landlord Accreditation Scheme. However, much more information can be accessed on this grant via our web pages, which I have linked at the bottom of the slide there. In terms of eligible works, this will cover measures such as loft insulation, flat roof insulation, as well as wall insulation and floors. Again, more information on our website about that and kind of some of the caveats around that and kind of more detailed alternatives. So moving on to the next sort of funding element, which is the Camden Climate Fund. So the Camden Climate Fund is funded by Camden's carbon offset payments. And these are payments that are collected through the planning system when developments in Camden fall short of the set carbon emissions targets. And what we do is we use this money to provide funding support for homeowners, landlords, businesses, other groups as well, to install renewable measures with a view to sort of not only reducing bills and kind of making buildings more energy efficient, but really to cut emissions as well. So with the current household fund, which is applicable to domestic landlords, we have £1,500, a maximum of £1,500 available, and that is to cover up to 50% of the costs, and that is required to be match funded by the landlord. So this applies to renewable measures, and in particular, this is relating to solar PV and also solar thermal. And the fund is available for these measures up until the end of June of this year. So to sort of reflect the need to decarbonise heat as what we've previously set out earlier, we've repurposed the fund, and we're looking to launch this sort of in the summer of this year. And what we've done is we have included a number of energy efficiency measures. Again, including insulation, heat pumps, solar thermal, as these really are sort of the measures that are going to accrue the most carbon savings within our homes and kind of help us with that trajectory of decarbonising heat from within our homes. We've also increased the funding amount. This is going to sit at £5,000 and will cover up to 50% of the costs. And again, we will require landlords or households to match fund this. I've included a link there where you can read all about the various different funds that we offer, and also sort of by clicking on that link, you can access all the T's and C's around that. I've also just included a link below that. If you are considering carrying out works and looking for sort of contracts and installers, we would recommend going via the Trustmark website. This is a government endorsed website, and it sort of provides landlords, homeowners with the confidence that by going through that route and searching for an installer, that the contractor that they go with is well, holds all the appropriate accreditations, should I say. So the final grant, which may not be as applicable, but again, something to bear in mind, this is the empty property grant. And this is applicable for landlords that have properties that have been vacant for around 12 months. And for landlords to be able to claim this fund, they also must be a member of the London Landlord Accreditation Scheme, and landlords will be expected to sign a nomination agreement to the council for 3 years. So just to sort of break down this table a little bit in more detail. So we've got, again, varying different amounts of money available depending on the size of the dwelling and the number of rooms. Again, we do sort of place a cap on this. And within the building, if you are looking to kind of claim grants for various different buildings, various different dwellings within the building, and that was to equate to more than £80,000, it would be capped at the £80,000, which is in that bottom row there, £80,000 per building. So that was sort of a bit of a whistle-stop tour on grants. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to hand over to Dave, and Dave is going to talk to us a little bit about the government proposals to MEES for 2025. So over to you, Dave, and just let me know when you want me to move through the slides.
Thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me to speak on this. I'm Dave Prinsip, as has been mentioned. I've had quite a lot of involvement in energy efficiency over the years. I being an enforcing officer, but for the last 10-15 years been a consultant, and I've been very heavily involved with the private rented sector, being a policy officer for the RLNA, and also a landlord. I was involved, as said earlier, with chairing the committee which was set up to initially establish the minimum energy efficiency standards in the regulations. So I've got quite a bit of experience of the government and their proposals. I'm a little cynical sometimes of the government, but we'll move on. Next slide, please. Yeah, the landlord, the private rented sector is about to be hit by a tidal wave of requirements which are significantly going to increase the demand on landlords to upgrade their properties to deal with the climate change problems. There's a significant amount of evidence growing now that climate change is beginning to have a significant effect. 5 of the hottest years on record have been in the last 6 years. Between 3 and 10 times more people are being displaced due to climate change than due to conflict. Temperatures have risen 1 degree since 1850, which doesn't sound a lot, but it isn't uniform, so it's causing real problems. And recently the government have issued a significant amount of policy and strategic documentation, clean growth strategy in 2017, which said that private rented properties should be band C by 2035. We've had the green finance strategy looking at financing of commercial and industrial processes with a green slant. Recently, last year, there was the 10-point plan for green industrial revolution, and this is looking at encouraging and supporting green growth, green jobs, accelerating the path to zero. And then amongst other strategies, we've got the fuel poverty strategy, which has been consulted on this year. And from the private rented sector point of view, it's quite significant because on average, about 10% of all properties, all households are in fuel poverty, i.e. they can't really afford to heat their property to the required standard. But in the private rented sector, over a quarter of properties are in fuel poverty. Their households are in fuel poverty. And it's statistically, they say that if you improve the EPC rating from a band G to a band C, then the tenants, the occupiers, would save almost £2,500 a year in heating costs. So it's a significant amount of money, which puts the pressure on the tenants. And from a landlord's point of view, if you can reduce the bills that that the tenant has to pay for heating the property, then there's more money the tenant has to actually pay their rent. And there's quite a bit of evidence to show that the more energy efficient a property is, the less turnover you get, the less voids you get, and the longer and happier tenancies you get as well. So we're about to be hit. This is basically a talk about what the government are proposing in the very near future. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, we've already heard that the current MEES standards are minimum of band E or above, and there's some exemptions as well, which will allow properties which can't or haven't reached that standard to be let. The latest statistics show that nationally there's about 3% of all properties are band F and G, and that's reduced from 4% the year before. But really, there's a lag in getting the statistics, so it is probable that the regulations have, certainly from the private rented sector, reduced the number of properties that are in band F and G. Okay, so we'll now look at the proposals that the government have, and I'm not sure that the private rented sector has really got his head around how significant these changes are going to be, and there seems to be little chance of the government not going ahead with these proposals in some form, very similar to what they're proposing. So next slide, please. Okay, so the government issued a consultation in September last year on their proposals for amending the MEES standards. Now, this will be the third time they've been amended, and there is evidence in the consultation that it may not be the last change. But they are proposing to raise the minimum EPC standards to rent out a property to band C, which means in Camden, about 55% of the properties will not be compliant. Nationally, it's about 67%. So Camden is in a slightly better position in some respects than nationally, but much of the difference there is due to the fact that there's such a high level of flatted properties in Camden, and they do tend to have a higher energy efficiency than detached and semi-detached properties. These standards, they propose to introduce them from 2025, which is 4 years ahead. And this will apply to new tenancies. They are allowing a 3-year leeway for existing tenancies. So if you've got an existing tenancy and the property isn't a band C, you will be able to rent it out until 2018 before you will have to carry out any works. Now, this is significant. This is a tremendously tight timescale. And there was initially some discussion that they may extend it slightly, but we'll have to wait and see. The government had indicated that they were going to have the proposals considered and would respond to the consultation about now, but it hasn't been released at the moment. But all the indications are that they're not going to change them significantly. And certainly at the last consultation they did, their proposals, which they came forward, were actually higher than what they were proposing in the consultation. So hopefully they won't do that this time, but it is going to significantly affect all rented properties in many areas of the country. And as I say, 67% of all dwellings which are rented don't comply with the current Band C. They're also looking at increasing the landlord's maximum investment cap from the £3,500 to £10,000. Now, the proposal that they put forward has their recommendation, what they would like to see, but they also give other options as well. But they've indicated that their recommended level would be £10,000, but they're also discussing and asking for views on £5,000 and £15,000 maximum. So we will have to wait and see, as I say, what's that's going to mean. They are also amending or proposing to amend the works that should be carried out, or certainly the order in which works are carried out should the recommended works be necessary to bring it up to the minimum standard. At the moment, it's entirely up to the owner, to the landlord, which works they carry out. They can do the boiler, to bring it up to the minimum of E, or they can do insulation. The government are indicating that it'll be basically fabric first. They are looking at landlords spending money on insulating the property, dealing with the structure of the property before they spend money doing the boilers, etc. And yet boilers will often have a bigger bang for their bucks than some of the insulation work, certainly if there's existing reasonable levels of insulation. But they're proposing that that be changed, so you will have to do the structural elements first before you do the installations associated with heating, etc. They are also significantly increasing in their proposals the penalty for landlords from £5,000 to £30,000. And bear in mind, we're now talking only 4 years away to carry out these works. So these are really significant. The government intend in their proposal to have the regulations drafted and passed by the end of this year. Which means, as I say, once that happens, then landlords will only have 3.5 years probably to get their properties up to standard to ensure compliance. Okay, next slide. They are also in the document proposing to establish a new database. This is a database which will have details of all the rented properties and show whether each property is compliant, and if not, what exemption they're actually using in order to rent out the property. And they're looking at a cost of £30 per property. Now, I'll be interested to see what actually their response is to this, because this sounds to me as if it's basically a national registration scheme for the private rented sector, because all rented properties will have to have an entry on this database. And this is something that has been talked about for a long time, basically to do with general standards and management of properties that are rented out, but now they're proposing to introduce it as part of their energy efficiency and climate change targets. They're also looking to encouraging and increasing the ease with which prosecutions can take place, because at the moment it is quite fraught for enforcing authorities to actually do prosecutions under these regulations. Basically, they're going to allow local authority to inspect the property to make sure that it has got a bona fide EPC. As I say, increase the penalties, we talked about that. They are also looking at giving tenants the power to require improvements where the property isn't compliant. And at the moment, the private rented sector energy efficiency regulations, under which MEES is one part of it, does allow a tenant to ask for works to be carried out, but they have to pay for it themselves under the current regulations. So surprise, surprise, very few tenants have actually asked if they can pay for central heating to be installed in the landlorded property. But this seems to be a proposal that the tenant can basically request the landlord to improve the property, and obviously then there's going to be penalties if not. They are looking at changing the requirements around EPCs. So, currently, if you have an EPC and you carry out an improvement works to it, there is no legal requirement for you to get a new EPC to show what impact those improvements have occurred. Obviously, when you do get a new EPC, then those works would be reflected in the new EPC, but you don't currently have to get a new EPC if you change the boiler or put solid wall insulation in, etc. They're proposing that that be changed. So if you do energy efficiency works, you must get a new EPC. How that will work in practice, we will have to wait and see. And they're also going to allow councils to use bulk data on EPC database in order to carry out enforcement against non-compliant landlords. Okay, next slide. Okay, some of the other amendments, basically for agents and online letting platforms, they're only going to be able to advertise properties that are compliant, either compliant with a minimum of C or will have had an exemption registered. The landlord must provide a valid EPC before they rent the property. At the moment, you can rent out a property, you can advertise a property, provided you are in the process of seeking an EPC. And what happens in the rental market is, certainly when demand is high, the property is let to the tenants, proposed tenants, even before they get the EPC, although there's only a short time scale because of the demand for rented properties. Often the tenant who says, yes, I'll have this property, doesn't have the opportunity to see the EPC. They're proposing that is changed, so you must have an EPC before you market a property. As I say, the tenants have a right to request improvements, and they'll be able to seek damages, i.e. sue the landlord where the property is in breach. And this is a trend that the government have been extending over many years, where in effect the tenant can, in a way, take enforcement action against the landlord if they don't comply, if their property is not band C or they don't have an exemption. So this is a way to try and weed out the landlords who have fallen under the radar. The local authority don't know about them, so they can't prosecute them, but the tenant can take action. And what will happen here is there will be ambulance chasing companies doing this. So a tenancy will come to an end, and then the old tenant will then sue the landlord because the property wasn't up to standard. So, and an interesting or potentially worrying aspect of this is that they don't propose to change the exemptions. They'll basically last for 5 years, except for new tenancies where the landlord will have 6 months to carry out improvements, which isn't really an awful lot of use, because if the property needs work carried out on it, you're not going to want to carry out those when the tenant's in situ. So it makes more sense to do it at the very beginning, but that exemption's there. But they're not going to change that. Okay, next slide. Those are what they propose to implement, subject to the consultation and their response, but they are seeking views on other issues as well. You don't need to have an EPC on a property unless you are renting it, selling it, or it's being built. And if you have a tenancy, a long-term tenancy, and the EPC expires, you're not required to have a new EPC. It's only when you rent it out again. They're seeking views on whether, very much like a gas certificate, when the old EPC expires, you must get a new one. They're looking at the exemptions around listed buildings, because that's a nightmare. The only way with a listed building or in a conservation area, whether you can tell whether you need an EPC is to get an EPC and then see what the recommended works are. If the recommended works require a material change to the property, then you don't need the EPC you've got. They're looking at modifying that and seeking views on that. They're looking at what method can be used for the private rented sector to support the rollout of smart meters, which is an initiative which they missed the previous target. So whether that will be, again, what they mean by support, we will have to wait and see. Whether the regulations will need further tightening, so even in this current proposal, they're looking at possibly tightening it up in future periods. And they're also looking at views if the cost cap was at £15,000, whether tighter terms would be required, and whether how this would be carried out, and also whether they should only restrict the requirement for works to be carried out to trustmark contractors only, or not, and they're seeking views on that. Okay, next. Okay, so this is basically the last slide. There are some issues with this. As I say, 67% of the private rented sector properties are below Band C. That means 3 million households in the private rented sector are non-compliant. That is a huge amount of potential work that's got to be carried out in a relatively short period of time. Are there sufficient contractors? We had the problem with the Green Homes Grant, where part of the problem was there were not enough trustmark contractors out there to carry out the works. There was also a problem with the logistics behind it. Funding, where will the funding come from this? The Green Homes Grant has been pulled. Fortunately, if you have a property in Camden, there are some grants which are available, which is very good, but there's very, very little. The Green Deal is technically still there, but it's completely moribund. It's not going to, there's no proposal at the moment, and there's no Green Deal provider who will issue a new Green Deal loan. They may have to review that because it could be the only way for some landlords to actually carry out the works. Is there sufficient time? You're basically going to have 4 years now to bring your property up to Band C. Now, it takes a long time to get it organised. You need to find out what works need to be done, to organise contractors, try to get it done during void periods, which is the best time, because tenants do not want work carried out when they're in the properties as a norm. There is a problem with the EPCs. As we heard earlier, Camden is very keen on getting rid of gas, and gas has got to go. The government are proposing, banning very shortly new homes from having gas boilers. But the way the EPCs worked, because it's very heavily influenced by the cost of the fuel, if you change electric heating to gas heating, you will get a better EPC, which is sort of not exactly what they want when the real overall aim is to do with climate change. The accuracy of EPCs, it's going to mean a difference between one point can mean you can rent the property or not. And as you go further up the bands, then it's more difficult to increase the scoring, and some are going to fail just by 1 point, and there are inaccuracies in EPCs. The exempt period is 5 years maximum, and if the cost cap is kept at £10,000, then if you were to have an example there of the external wall insulation is a recommended work, £9,000, solar heating 8,000, double glazing 5,000. What you would do when this was first initially launched, you would have to carry out one of those works up to £5,000, probably double glazing the first time. You would then be able to enter an exemption because you would have to spend more than £10,000 in order to bring it up, or try to bring it up to the standard. So you would be entitled to an exemption. After 5 years, you have to go again. So you've done the double glazing, you've got solar heating and external wall insulation. So you have to then carry that out if the £10,000 cap remains. And then at the end of that 5-year exemption, you've got to spend up to £10,000, which would be the final work. So over a period of time, you would carry out those works. Okay, so this could have an impact on landlords. Also, you have to get 3 quotes, and contractors are going to charge for this, I think, particularly when there's 3 million people asking for quotes potentially for carrying out works. And final slide. This is one of the reasons why I'm a little cynical about the government's approach to energy efficiency. This is just some of the initiatives the government have launched and then scrapped. But there's little chance of them scrapping their proposal to increase the minimum MEES. And final slide. Yeah. Okay. They stopped carbon capture in 2015, funding towards that, but 3 years later they relaunched the proposal. So unfortunately, the government don't seem to have a coherent approach to actually driving this forward. But time's running out. Climate change is serious, and that's something landlords need to get their heads around. Okay, and last slide, which is just thank you. Okay, thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much for that, Dave. That was really interesting, and I think with a lot of this information, it can sometimes come across quite over, when all these proposals are kind of put forward by government, it can be somewhat confusing for landlords and quite overwhelming. So I think that's been really, really great to kind of hear about those proposals sort of set out really clearly. So thank you very much for that. Michaela, I don't know if we've had any questions through the chat function.
No, not yet. So does anyone have any questions they'd like to put to us?
Silence. We've clearly
now is your chance.
I think somebody's put their hand up.
Yeah, that's me.
Okay.
Thanks for the presentation, Dave. That was very, very, very interesting. I just wanted to quickly ask kind of what your recommendation would be to kind of private landlords who had, say, a number of properties, and how to go about kind of complying with this legislation, given the projected changes moving forward. Would you recommend sort of acting now and kind of getting a better picture of their properties and what needs doing, or to kind of wait until the kind of changes in legislation are confirmed and see what the best way forward is? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. My personal view is act now. Certainly start the process now. Have a look at what your EPCs say and have a look and see what works it recommends. I don't think even if they delay it, it'll just be a couple of years. So you are almost definitely going to have to bring it up to C. There's policies going back now 10 years saying they're looking to the private rented sector being a minimum bound C. So they will bring it forward. Have a look at your EPC, see what works need to be done. When you get a void period, when a tenant leaves, then that's the time to carry out major works to the property. Some of the works you may be able to do if you've got loft, then you can do loft insulation with a tenant in situ and it isn't going to cause any problem. The big problem is, as far as we can see, is going to be the provision of contractors. I know in some parts of the country, when they introduced the requirement for electrical inspections, there was a shortage, a huge shortage of electricians. Well, there are significantly more electricians available than there are contractors who can carry out this work accurately. And the one advantage of using a trust mark contractor is that they will look at the whole house. They will not just go in and say, well, I'm going to put double glazing in there and that's it, because that can cause problems with condensation. They will look at the whole house and they may suggest double glazing. To be honest, unlikely, but if they did, they would then look at the ventilation. So do approach your contractors, look and see what works need to be done, and look for the reputable companies and start getting quotes. If you can get somebody on board now before they pass the legislation, then you will have a head start, and at least you'll be, you know, halfway there to getting the work. They do say, by the way, that the average cost for landlords is going to be £4,700. That is an average. And obviously there's going to be those landlords whose properties really are not going to be viable to improve. Not so much in Camden, but you know, in certain northern cities, you can buy a terrace property for about £50,000. Well, if on that example that I had, you had to spend about £25,000 to rent it out, it's just not viable. So have a look at the EPC. Make sure it's up to date. If you've got an old EPC and you've got solid wall, and I mean old EPC before 2017, then they changed the database on the energy efficiency of the properties, solid wall properties, so you will get a better EPC. So if you've got solid wall and it's an EPC prior to 2017, consider getting a new EPC. Look at any new ones you've got, see what works they've got, and do start approaching landlords, the contractors now, Trustmark contractors.
Great, thanks, Dave.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dave. And I think really nice sort of the nod to sort of the whole house approach there, which is absolutely what we want to be encouraging, and not sort of going down this route of ad hoc measures that then don't necessarily kind of support or complement other measures that could be sort of installed within a home. I noticed that we had sort of one question quickly come in there, and that was around, does MEES apply to property lets on a temporary basis, or is it kind of specific to Airbnbs? I'm not sure who wants to take this within our team.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. So EPCs are only required for properties that are let on an assured, regulated or domestic agricultural agreement, which does suggest that at the moment, Airbnbs or houses that are let on a real temporary basis would not be covered by MEES. However, that's never to say that this could change in the future, and that there may be an EPC requirement going forward.
Great, thank you for that, Michaela. I'm conscious of time. We've just sort of slipped over 1:30. If there are any other questions that have come through in the chat, we will pick these up after the session, and we'll circulate a response to that afterwards. I think at this point I will just kind of provide a couple of sort of closing remarks just to kind of sum up our discussion so far. I think sort of it's quite apparent that reducing emissions within our housing stock is really quite a challenge, and we all have our role to play, and that does include landlords within the private rented sector. And given that sort of accounts for a third of our housing stock in Camden, yeah, it's going to be a really important route to carbon reduction. We've heard about MEES and sort of the EPCE minimum to achieve, and after kind of listening to Dave's presentation as well, further changes are on the horizon, and it's almost best to kind of act now as opposed to kind of waiting and being further down the line, and perhaps being in a situation where it's a really competitive market for contractors, installers to kind of carry out those works so that you are in fact meeting those regulations. So yeah, I think it's going to be quite an ambitious journey, and that's really where we want to sort of foster this proactive versus reactive approach with landlords in Camden. And there is funding support available, as we have outlined, and also various resources in different capacities. As Dave also mentioned, you know, that there's kind of limited support out there on the whole, but we're fortunate in Camden that we do have various different grants that we can offer landlords. I just want to finish on this last slide. We have some sort of resources that we're signposting to here. Of course, the government website details all of that information, but we've got some other useful, reputable resources that are for landlords on this topic in particular. So I just want to finish there by saying thank you to everyone for joining us. I really hope this session has been useful. I've certainly found it really interesting, and I want to extend a thanks to Dave for joining us today and delivering a fantastic presentation, and also thanks to Michaela for delivering her presentation as well. We will be circulating a copy of the slides after the session, and this will also be uploaded to our webpage along with the recording of the session. So everything is all accessible. But please do keep up to date with our webpage. We are always kind of updating that and thinking of sort of new themes that we can engage with people with sort of the topic of retrofit. So yeah, I'd just like to sort of say thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and we hope to see you at a future webinar. Thanks all.
Yep, thank you, everyone.